Hello, and welcome back to Acro's Good Clinical Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia McLeod. Today on GCP, I'm joined by Andrea Bastick, VP of Market Strategy at Florence Healthcare, Ashley Davidson, VP, Head of Product at Advara, and Christine Sen, SVP of Site Sponsor Innovation, also at Advara. Andrea, Christine, and Ashley explore how, when it comes to study startup, collaborations, smarter process design, and emerging tech can reduce the burden on sites and improve timelines. They also offer practical recommendations on how to move toward a more efficient and connected feasibility model. We also have a couple resources for those interested. You'll find the CDA template published by Advara's Site Sponsor Consortium, Advara's Site ID feasibility solution, and a paper from Florence's Site Enablement League regarding redefining feasibility in clinical trials, all linked in the show notes and episode description. And with that, let's get into the episode. Well, today I am joined by Andrea, Ashley, and Christine, and I'm so excited to have you guys on this episode of GCP. I think this will be a really interesting one and something we haven't talked about much on the podcast before. So I'm excited to dive in. We are here today to talk about site feasibility and the role that it plays in study startup, site selection, and activation in that whole paradigm. But this is something where I think it's probably likely that if I asked 10 people how to define feasibility, they would probably define it 10 different ways. So I thought for the purposes of our conversation today, would love to hear from you guys how we should be thinking about feasibility. What part of feasibility are we talking about? And maybe what piece of it are you most interested and passionate about? So Andrea, let's start with you on that one.
Yes, I totally agree. And I learned that firsthand. If you're talking to a sponsor audience, they're probably thinking about sort of study planning feasibility, high level geographic feasibility for, is this protocol good? Where should we run this protocol? How should we think about these molecules and how to test them? When you're talking to sites, they're only thinking about site feasibility because that's the process that they're involved in. So that's where I'm most passionate. And that's where I've done the most sort of thinking and discussing. And that's what we're talking about mostly here today, too.
I kind of laugh. I'm a little bit of a terminology police and in my own organization because I agree. I think we, even in site level feasibility, I tend to hear terms thrown around interchangeably. And, we sort of use this larger feasibility umbrella to cover things like identification, qualification, all the different steps and, kind of sub processes in between. So just that single term gets thrown around very loosely across the board. So.
Totally.
Yeah. And this piece of, the whole feasibility paradigm we're talking about, it's something we've talked about for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's a persistent topic at conferences. Before we started recording, we were just talking about how we'll all probably see each other at an upcoming conference. And I have a feeling we'll be talking about this there as well. But it feels like we're coming up still after all of these conversations, coming up against a lot of challenges. So maybe just to level set for our listeners, what do each of you see as the main challenges when it comes to the feasibility process, or maybe thinking even broader, what challenges remain around study startup?
Absolutely. So I think of it from the site perspective, and just that there's more of a burden on sites than I think is always recognized. And I have seen definitely that a feasibility questionnaire, just starting there, can take 2 to 8 hours per form. And I don't think that it's truly, truly recognized how much time that takes then for a site over the course of a year and the number of personnel needed. So, one thing is for a complicated trial or maybe oncology or a trial with a lot of procedures or special procedures, you need to get information from multiple parts of the business, multiple departments. And that is very time consuming to get from all these different components of the business. In addition, another thing we don't always recognize is that there can be up to 3 feasibility questionnaires per trial because the CROs are trying to get the sponsor contract. And so they are trying to show that they have the best sites who can perform on the trial. And in doing so, you can recognize how exponential that time is for a site when you think about perhaps 3 feasibility questionnaires per trial, and how many trials are you trying to get per year? Of course, I would also say that just as a side note, sites are very concerned that they aren't even in sponsor CROs databases and they won't get selected. And that's a big concern for future revenue potential for sites.
Yeah, I'll double click on that a little bit. I mean, I think, Kristen, you kind of alluded to it. It's really, for me, it's the evidence of performance, right? That's really what sponsors and CROs are after. And I think my perspective is the industry at large, from a data perspective, really is quite lacking in terms of the trust in that data. And so that's why it tends to still be such a manual process, and they feel like they can't trust their data, so they need to go out, with these large feasibility surveys or multiple surveys, as Christine just mentioned. And the funny thing for me is that, everyone across the stakeholder groups are really protective of that performance information, right? Sites don't want to share it. Different sponsors and CROs kind of think it's a little bit of their secret sauce. And so there's just a little bit of the need to continue to collaborate in this area so that, number one, sites can understand what criteria they're even being measured against, and kind of a little bit of an opening of the kimono, so to speak, of to be able to improve this part of the process. Otherwise, it's going to continue being manual and not data driven.
I totally agree with all of that. And the last thing I would say is that everyone's in a hurry, right? And because we're in a hurry, we're trying to start the process really early. And we're trying to start the process before we even have all the decisions made about how the protocol is going to be run. So now sites are getting feasibility questionnaires without a full protocol, or maybe without a lab manual, or without a imaging manual. So they're asked to respond to these questions about patient population, equipment, staff capabilities, that they can respond to only within the information they're given. So if those decisions change later, or the protocol's finalized, or the lab manual comes out, but it has new information in it, the answers to the feasibility questionnaires before that information was provided aren't really valid. And yet sites are not, of course, just lucky they're not asked to redo the feasibility questionnaire all the time. At the same time, they're sort of held to a response that was based on incomplete information. So that sort of like going slow to go fast would be a smarter way, right? We have all the information, the decisions made to get the correct answers to judge sites and how they're going to be able to perform and if they're capable of doing a study. So I see that sort of like speed versus time versus accuracy is kind of a problem in how we're running the process, in addition to all the problems that Christine and Ashley already mentioned.
Yeah, no, I think you guys definitely have kind of captured the main things that we hear about often. I'm wondering if we could pivot maybe to something a little more positive and leave the challenges there for now, and maybe think about some recommendations you guys have to the industry. The CDA process is frequently listed as a common bottleneck that hampers the feasibility process from even getting started, even getting off the ground. So, Christine, if you think about your work with Advara's Site Sponsor Consortium, what does meaningful collaboration between sites and sponsors actually look like in practice? I think beyond shared documents, and maybe how might mutual CDA templates support or catalyze that collaboration?
A collaboration for me definitely means that people are listening to each other's pain points and then working together to rethink processes because of it. Because it's really not enough to have a process map at your organization that doesn't take into account the process maps that are at other organizations. So I'm not saying it has to be so specific, like when this site works with this CRO, this is how it looks. But just in general, I think knowing what each site needs to go through, which is different by different type of site, right? What the CROs need to go through, what the sponsors need to go through, and really understanding that helps them understand these are the pain points, this is what we need to work toward in terms of solving for. Our process has to involve your process, and also what's a non-negotiable, and is it really a non-negotiable? I think that's an important part, because a lot of us have legacy processes that perhaps are just legacy processes, right? They're not true non-negotiables. Can we think of a better way? So thank you for asking about the CDA project. So this is, it's it seems like such a small throwaway portion to a lot of people. When I interviewed people from different aspects of our industry, they were saying, many of them, I will say many people were saying that, a CDA is something we've never even heard of anyone getting sued over. And other people are saying, no, we need to fight and negotiate for everything. So the Site Sponsor Consortium is comprised of 20 people, pretty small group, so that we could really get into each other's process maps a lot. And it's 5 sponsors, 5 CROs, 5 institutional sites, and 5 commercial sites. So we have a nice representation. And by having each group really talk through their processes, we were able to look at each other's process maps and say, this would be the most streamlined way for your group to do CDAs. But beyond that, we thought, well, how can we actually get rid of what's causing the hangups. So it turned out that a lot of institutional sites, if they have state funding in particular, they had to have their state listed in the CDA. And that was causing delays of weeks to sometimes months as they negotiated this. So as an example is we decided as a group that it was totally okay to lay silent on the jurisdiction of a CDA. Now, you're still going to have to negotiate when you get to a CTA because that is really such an important part of a trial and how everything will, how you'll be paid and how everything will be operationalized. But the CDA, you can still sue if you want to, but which people really don't. But it is laying silent on jurisdiction. If we just don't have to negotiate that, it could save so much time in study startup. But I think that's how we're really going to get to an actionable step is what do all of these groups actually need to do and how can we let go of some of our old thoughts for a better process.
Christine, that's such a great point about the CDA. It's such a small step in the overall process, but what a good opportunity for time savings. Similarly, we have a working group that's part of the league, which is also a cross industry group, site sponsors and CROs participating together to talk about industry challenges. We published a peer-reviewed journal article about feasibility where we talk about the timing a lot. And I'd say, again, this small, simple recommendation there was just timing and speed. So waiting until you have final or near final drafts of some of these very important documents like lab manuals, imaging manuals that can really affect how sites operationalize a clinical trial. Before you're asking those protocol-specific feasibility questions where they might be responding inaccurately, as we mentioned before, or responding in a way that changes as that information changes later. So timing and speed and CDA, again, small parts of the process, but easy to make a change, a process change that can really have a significant downstream impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So much of the work that you guys do really helps to give sites and sponsors insights into the practicalities of a number of steps along this clinical trial roadmap. Andrew, I'd love to start with you on this one and then hopefully hear from Ashley as well here. But I'm curious about how real-time operational visibility and automation, whether that's site performance metrics, AI-assisted feasibility surveys, whatever the case may be, how that stuff really can help to revolutionize how sponsors and sites can assess and act on feasibility insights in more real time.
Yeah, thanks for the question. This ties back to things that Christine and Ashley were both already saying, right? So first of all, feasibility questionnaires take a huge amount of time. So if we can just leverage the answers we've already provided, have a database of questions and answers that sites can use with AI to fill out, especially some of those repetitive questions that come up in feasibility questionnaires all the time, that can save a huge amount of time. So Christine was mentioning 2 to 8 hours per questionnaire. With an automated AI feasibility survey question and answer library, we could significantly reduce that amount of time. Like Christine was saying, I might have to go out to other parts of the business to ask about patient volumes or therapeutic, care pathways. I can really focus my attention on those important questions rather than having to, regurgitate how many refrigerators I have on site, right? So that's one way that Florence is thinking about this problem. And then another way would be thinking about how we can pull operational data, which is controversial, as Ashley was saying, right? Everyone's so protective of their performance data. They're afraid to share or they're not aware of what's being shared about them or with other folks, what's being calculated behind the scenes, so to speak. So we think a lot about this and we have to think a lot about how that information can be displayed and shared and how you provide the right context for it, right? The lack of trust comes because there's not good context, right? So if a sponsor's looking back at their old performance data for a site, but they are not aware that there's been staff turnover or that was one department, but not the other department. That kind of context that comes with performance data is often missing and provides or causes a big problem in trusting the data that's out there. So it's a challenging problem, but as Ashley was mentioning, it's important for us to figure out how to overcome that problem.
Yeah, I think the good thing is some of the conversations we've had on the Advar side, we see positive signals from sites that they want to understand that better and they want to be able to share. But I think it's to Andrea's point, it's really the visibility and again, what data is being used and why. But I think to your question, Sophia, I think, real-time operational visibility is super important. But I think that also can mean different things depending on vendor capabilities and sort of how we approach it. I think those of us, like, the two companies here on this podcast are able to provide visibility into real-time operational data more so than maybe some other vendors, because sites are actually procuring our technology systems, right, and using that as their operational systems on a day-to-day basis to run trials. And so I think the data piece is super important, but also connectivity is super important. And so Advar really places a really strong emphasis on that. And what I mean by that is connecting those systems that sites are using to the broader ecosystem, whether that's within our own vendor technology landscapes or whether that's connecting site systems to sponsor and CRO systems. So I think trying to bridge that gap a little bit, because I think it's the data plus connectivity that's going to enable things like the better workflows, or being able to enable, some of the more sophisticated capabilities like pre-filling of surveys and those types of things. So that, I think, combined is what's going to reduce the burden on sites during the feasibility process.
Yeah, and both of your companies, Advara and Florence, are two of Acro's more technology grounded. And with that in mind, I would love to kind of stick on this tech for process line of questioning. And I was hoping we could talk about how we can use technology to aid in really ensuring that we're using everyone's time effectively. Because I think we all know site staff are very busy. They have a lot going on, and this is probably not like their favorite part of their job. So when you guys are thinking about this, what strategies, whether they're digital or maybe process based, are most effective for reducing redundant feasibility assessments and maybe refocusing site staff time on more high value activities, shall we say?
Yeah, I can kick this one off. I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier in the previous question, but our approach here at Advara is a little bit twofold. So one of the most simple things in terms of our approach is really to try to reduce the system access and logon burden, right? And obviously that's super important in feasibility, because you're talking about sites that haven't even been officially selected for a study yet. So you really want to try to reduce that barrier to even responding to surveys or responding to any other, kind of qualification, related activities. And then the second piece is really, again, being able to use the data in more intelligent ways. And some of that is the connectivity that I mentioned earlier. But, we try to think about this process as a more data-driven process and trying to pull that a little bit further upstream to better utilize the data that you have to make those qualification decisions, so that you can reduce the need for sending out surveys and maybe even eventually eliminate it altogether. So I think we're just trying to take a more data-driven approach overall.
Yeah, I'd say similar thought process here, right? Both being site-focused companies, it's really important to think about, what is really time wasted at the site. And if we have a relationship, or if I can surface the information to a sponsor that I've worked with before, I shouldn't have to repeat the same answers over and over again. So sort of leveraging that data, as Ashley was mentioning, in a smarter, more persistent intelligence type of way, really helps connect everyone in a smarter way, where we're not repeating the same things over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all agree here that technology is great. So, an extremely helpful tool that stakeholders across the ecosystem can leverage. At the same time, we also, I think, talk about this point a lot, which is that tech adoption at the site level can be a bit of a sticking point still to this day. So I'm curious if you guys have any practical steps that you wanted to share that, technology providers and sponsors are taking to ensure that some of the smaller, maybe less digitally mature, if we can say, sites also benefit from these tools rather than being left behind, which I think is what no one wants to see.
It's a really good challenging question, because the flip side is also true, right? Like as a sponsor or a CRO, I am interfacing with sites that have very digitally mature tech stacks and sites that do not. And I have to satisfy both of them, like both of those, right? So we talk a lot at Florence about flexible digital mandates, meaning, sponsors and CROs providing technology for sites that don't have access to it in a way that makes sense, and tools that they're needing to work in or that support the site workflows. But also being flexible enough to accept the technology stacks that big, mature, digitally mature sites and site networks have already, right? So it's really a challenge for everyone, because there has to be a lot of flexibility. And, can we accept systems that are already in use place? Can we put systems in place where there aren't systems so that at least we're getting everybody off paper, right? That would be the most important common denominator, is to get off paper. But it really does require some flexibility and collaboration, connection, as Ashley was mentioning earlier, right? Can we integrate or, accept data from different systems to really leverage the whole landscape that's out there?
Yeah, the importance of getting new sites cannot be underestimated, I think, in clinical research. And it has been quite a bit of a challenge. So when I started in clinical research, I did start at an academic medical center and it had technology, but my next role was at a very small site. And the process of growing it and having to grow our technology the decade or however long it was, till we got to the point of being a site network and had ubiquitous technology, right? We had it all at some point. It was very interesting because our challenges as a smaller site was very different than our challenges as a site network with technology and otherwise. So I would say that where we want to be is as the connector. We want to create, what Ashley was saying about interoperability between the site's technology and other systems in the ecosystem. One of our more, I think, fascinating partnerships recently has been with Icon, and we are working together to equip the emerging and research naive sites with Advara site technology, so the CTMS, eSource, eRegulatory. That should enable that more research sites worldwide can support today's complex trials and have standardized operations and reduce manual processes. And just being on that same technology guided by the industry, by ICON, I think allows the smaller organizations can use technology that maybe they couldn't have otherwise, which to me is extraordinary. Just having run a smaller site, that would have been really helpful to me.
Yeah, it's so interesting, I think, when you kind of all bring your perspectives from across your career and the way that that informs, the recommendations that you're putting into things like the consortium or the league, and really kind of helping to make things in the ecosystem better and kind of push us along this pathway to easier technology integration, which I know we all want. And I think, staying on the spirit of positivity, I'd love to close us out with having each of you leave our listeners with either a piece of advice or maybe a call to action to help us as an industry move towards this smoother experience, particularly in the early stages of getting a trial off the ground.
Sure. And I love the question about a practical takeaway. And I think we've all tried to focus on that here, right? So we need to collaborate. There are always wonderful things that come out about what we need to do better. But my specific call to action this year is going to be about the CDAs, just because it's top of mind for me. So I would love to see that sponsors of all sizes, that AMCs, hospitals, and cancer centers all meet with your legal teams with our white paper, our CDA white paper in hand, and make the case for a simplified process and a simplified CDA. Whether it's the sponsor pointed out that it can be simplified, or it's the larger institutional sites talking to their legal teams about accepting a simplified CDA and why it will work. That's my call to action.
So we actually just had our Ensemble user community conference last week, which is our site CTMS users. And, what we consistently heard last week was that sites, again, I alluded to this earlier, they have no idea what criteria sponsors are using to select them. It's really a black hole for them. And so what I would say is a super easy call to action is to just have more dialogue, right? I love Andrea's suggestion of, go slow to go fast. Part of that is having more dialogue about what they're looking at and why, what their needs are, right? And I know that's probably different depending on what level of information about the protocol is available when. And then in the opposite direction, I would say, as sponsors and CROs, can we provide some of that information back to the sites so that they have a feedback loop? They have, visibility in the opposite direction of, why they're getting selected or not, right? And really how they follow in those evaluations. I think we're hearing sites really desperate for some of that information.
Yeah, I hear the same thing, Ashley. And it's always shocking to hear that sites sometimes never hear back what the result was, right? They're just sort of in like perpetual limbo about what's, am I going to be selected or am I not? So love what you just said there. And then, yeah, I would reiterate, go slow to go fast. Consider, can you wait a little bit and provide more complete information? And everyone's always in a hurry, but can you understand the downstream implications? if you are armed with that information about like, hey, if we try to go faster, here's what's going to break downstream, that gives you some credibility to sort of, people who may be pressuring you upstream, to understand why it's important. So I'd say understand the process, problems, and implications, and that will help you make better decisions about timing.
Amazing. I think this was really helpful. I obviously am learning about a lot of this from you guys, but I think that those others who are also working in this space can really take this and run with it. So I'm hopeful about where we're going. I think we're moving in the right direction, and I think with folks like you guys leading the way, we'll get there. I have no worries. I want to thank you guys so much. I know you're all very busy, so thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today and talk through all this stuff. I think this was a really great episode, and hopefully we'll have you back in the future and kind of see where we are a year from now, maybe. Who knows?
That's great. Awesome.
Appreciate
We'll
it.
see you guys soon.
Thank you. Thanks so much for tuning in to ACRA's Good Clinical Podcast. We'll be back next week with a new episode.